My name is Brian Cathcart. I'm Professor of Journalism at Kingston University in South London, and I was one of the founders of Hacked Off, a pressure group which seeks a fair and accountable press. The Cairncross Review was set up by the government a year and a half ago to look at the future of journalism. I was very sceptical about this proposal not because I was worried about didn't believe there was a problem about the future of journalism, simply that I didn't trust and don't trust this government to take the interests of journalism seriously. They have a past record of being more interested in serving the interests of the proprietors and editors of friendly newspapers than they are in serving the interests of genuine journalism. I made a submission to the Cairncross Review, that's to say I wrote to them and made my suggestions. And my suggestions were basically that they should follow the proposals for reform of press regulation that were put forward by Sir Brian Leveson after his landmark inquiry in 2012. I didn't hear anything more, and this morning the report of the Cairncross Review panel, the Cairncross report it is now, was published. What does it suggest? Well, it proposes several things. One is a new state regulator to oversee the relationship between the news publishers, that's to say things like newspapers and broadcasters, and the tech giants, because it is accepted that organizations like Facebook and Google have been essentially stealing revenue from traditional news publishers. And what is proposed is a regulator which will try and rebalance that. Now that's very challenging. Lots of other countries are trying to do it, and not many have been successful. Another proposal is that there should be a new institute, a publicly funded independent body which will collect and distribute money, subsidies mostly, that's to say taxpayers' money, to independent public service journalism, generally. So the idea there is that there'll be a fund of, I don't know, a minimum of 20 and possibly more £1 million for them to support journalism where it needs it most, where the revenue systems have broken down, they would step in. And the focus here is local. There would also be money donated by Facebook and Google. I think they've probably screwed some promises out of them, but they're clearly expecting them to give money. And this body, this institute, which the Cairncross report says should be independent, is charged with distributing that money where it will most benefit the public. So where it will support journalism of the kind that the public needs. We need it to, for a functioning democracy. Where are the weaknesses in this? I like the ideas basically, and there are also some tax breaks. I like the ideas basically. It's a good idea to find money to support the journalism because it is struggling. My problem with it goes back to those powerful press corporations, the people who own the Sun newspaper and the Times, the people who own the Daily Mail, the people who own the Express and the Mirror, the Telegraph, and so on. These organizations, which are powerful and have a long track record of being unethical, sometimes illegal, often cruel, being abusive towards minorities, for example. These organizations, which have refused to reform, even since the phone hacking scandal, refused to reform. They are not accountable to anybody, really. These organizations, I don't want them to get money. Simple as that. Now, they would benefit, and nothing is being given in return. They would benefit from the tax break. That's one problem I have with it. Another problem is that although it's clear the Cairncross people want the money that's raised in tax and donations to go principally to local journalism, there is a problem with that, because in local journalism too, there are powerful proprietors. There are 3 big companies that dominate local newspapers and local journalism in the UK, and they have a terrible track record of plundering the industry, closing newspapers, and sacking journalists. They're not good for journalism, simple as that. One of them ships all its profits overseas. One of them puts its profits into paying off its big pensions problem and to buying national newspapers. That's the Mirror Group, which bought the Express recently. And the third of them, which is virtually bust, puts most of its income into paying off debt. So this is money being sucked out of local news and going everywhere else but back into it. I don't think they should get any money at all. I think ways should be found to support local journalism where the money that we give as taxpayers is guaranteed to really benefit journalists and journalism, and not shareholders and executives. That's what I'm looking for. So I think there's a problem with these proposals, which is that there aren't enough safeguards against the money going to the wrong people. And where the report says, this money should be administered by an independent body, it's a bit vague about how that independence should be achieved. It says it might be done this way. Well, I can be certain, because I have observed them and indeed watched them negotiating for many years. The people who run the big national press organizations will be working out every possible means by which they can get control of the body that distributes the funds so that they distribute themselves. So I think that's a big danger. Thanks.
Can I ask you a couple of questions whilst I've got you here?
Yes.
I suppose I could be described as a local journalist of sorts. In my time, about 5 or 6 years ago, I sent freedom of information requests to all the London councils about the loans that they had with banks. It turned out that they had derivative products, and some of them at quite unfavourable terms, usurious even. And this is only now starting to come out in the BBC London, for example. It's about 5 or 6 years since I started the work. Yeah. Other people have carried it on. So I feel very much like I'm part of the local journalism scene in a way. And it's very disheartening when you don't get any support from, for example, the bigger organisations. So I am concerned when I look at this whole grading thing that they say at I think it was letter F in the proposals. I think, I'm going to be rated as to whether or not I'm worth listening to. So in a way, it feels like it might even be a kind of McCarthy witch hunt. So either what will happen is the algorithms will be programmed against me, or there'll be a regulator that says what I say shouldn't be listened to, and that which can be listened to will be regarded as subprime. That is a concern for me in a world of gaming and targets. What do you have to say about that?
One of the things which the report says the new online regulator would do would be to oversee the measures taken by the tech giants to demonstrate to readers, or to help readers understand, what sources of information are reliable and what sorts are not reliable. Now, this is a big field. There are a lot of people working very hard on the ways in which this can be done, trying to find ways in which it can be done without censoring. So if you find a source of information that is very frequently wrong, or in fact demonstrably a kind of disinformation bot, then that should be labelled and people should be made aware of it. There is a long grey area between that and the reporter who occasionally gets things wrong. And I think navigating that territory, getting the right shade of grey, as it were, is very challenging. But it is something I think that has to be done. There is so much deliberate disinformation out there. Labelling the deliberate liars, I think, is essential, because people can't be expected to research every fact that they find online themselves. It's too difficult. It's too laborious. There are too many facts.
I find that I have difficulty even being allowed to comment on The Guardian's comments section. I'm pre-moderated to the point where I've given up. And that's without using any swearing, racial epithets or anything else. Occasionally I might refer to media ownership, and that gets me struck off immediately. So if the Guardian's moderators have said that I am essentially persona non grata, or at least that's how it feels, what's it going to be like when you have either computers or individuals somewhere making these types of decisions? Are you okay with that? It sounds like it is a good idea in some ways, and in other ways, people like me are going to get scared.
I think it's extremely difficult if computers are making the decision. I think that, as we know, computers only make the kinds of decisions that they're programmed to make. So ultimately, it will come back to some kind of human judgment. As I say, this is difficult, but some kind of effort has to be made. What we do not want is perfectly legitimate, peaceful participants in debate being kind of struck off and silenced. But, as I say, we also want some way of helping people to know when the information they're being given is being supplied by a source that routinely lies. So it's difficult, but I think some kind of effort has to be made. And I think there's a consensus that the responsibility for this kind of effort lies with big tech in the first place. Although I would argue, since so much of the information we read comes from our national press, and quite a lot of that is inaccurate, there is a huge responsibility on the national press to improve its accuracy record. That relates to the question of trust. My research shows that 4 out of 5 people in this country do not trust national newspaper journalists to tell the truth. And that's been a steady state for about 6 or 7 years. Now that's terrible. 20% belief rate, as it were, 20% trust. That's absolutely terrible. They need to be improving that enormously. And I don't see them making any effort whatsoever.
On Sunday, I saw in the Mail on Sunday on page 2 and page 20, which obviously was a hit job on the leader of the opposition, I saw it say that John McDonnell had admitted to voting leave. It said that on page 2 and page 20, which is completely untrue. What kind of systems are there in place at the moment for the Daily Mail or the Mail on Sunday or anyone else to actually have to make public apologies and take away from this kind of everyday lying?
The big national newspapers have historically regulated themselves. That's, as used to be said, marked their own homework. When the Leveson inquiry happened, he said that would have to stop, or at least that they could regulate themselves, but their regulators would have to meet certain standards. They refused to change. They renamed their old regulator, which everyone agreed had failed, relaunched it, and that's how they operate now. So if there is something wrong in the Mail on Sunday, for example, you can complain to the Mail on Sunday. Once you've been through their complaints process, if you're not happy with the outcome, you can then take that to the puppet regulator of the press, Ipso. It will take a very long time, and you have a chance that they'll find that you are right and the newspaper is wrong, maybe 6 months later, and you'll get a paragraph at the bottom of page 2, 6 months later, saying you were right and they were wrong, but probably in mealy-mouthed terms. And you will get no satisfaction at all, and they will just go and make more mistakes without impunity forever. This is not a system that checks bad standards, that prevents dishonesty and inaccuracy in journalism. It simply isn't. And that's been a problem for a long time. So they're not accountable for their unethical and inaccurate journalism.
Which leads me to ask the question, if their regulation is imperceptible, invisible, they're simply not regulated, why should social media or anybody else, my blog or Google or Facebook, be expected to hold themselves to any higher a standard if the people calling for all of the changes themselves are not doing it?
Well, I think that's important. I think the call for regulation of social media, regulation of big tech from the national newspapers is essentially extremely hypocritical. They refuse to be regulated themselves, but they're all in glee today at the idea of a state regulator for online. Now, I think um, that's hypocritical. But they are not a benchmark for anybody to do anything. They are merely a sign of what the worst can be when journalism really breaks down and it is completely unaccountable, and journalists are free to behave more or less as they like. That's where we are with most of the national press today. But I think that in the context of the Cairncross review, my feeling about it is that these papers, unless they agree to be regulated properly, once they do, if they agree to be regulated to the standards recommended by Sir Brian Leveson in his inquiry report, then they should qualify for subsidy if it's appropriate. They should be allowed to apply for it. I think that would be an incentive to them to raise their standards, and also a way of supporting the good journalism when it's there. But because they refuse to be regulated to those standards, I don't think a penny of public money should go towards them. And I have, as I say, reservations about the three big regional and local newspaper chains as well. They're not quite the same reservations, but they're significant.
The word philanthropy is used in the recommendations. So I saw the word tax, I saw the word regulation. At some point I saw the word philanthropy, which made me think of Jeff Bezos, made me think of Bill Gates, made me think of the woman who was married to Steve Jobs, and all of these people who go out and occasionally buy a media platform. How do you think that could play out, this idea of opening up to philanthropic donations? I know that Google, for example, fund the Bureau of Investigative Journalism.
Yes, I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind that a form of philanthropy has been involved in the British national press for a very long time. If you think that the Times newspaper, for the whole of the 20th century, bar I think 2 or 3 years, lost money, all of the proprietors of the Times newspaper for that period were just pouring money into it to keep it going. That's a kind of philanthropy. Most of the time that Rupert Murdoch has owned the Times, he's poured money into it to keep it going. So that you have to see that as a form of philanthropy, and it has all the complexities of the kind of benign model, as it were, because you never know what's benign. He's paying the bills. Is he paying the piper? You know, that's always the risk. But I think in the future, because the traditional advertising revenue streams are broken down, because the traditional print sales revenue streams are broken down or are breaking down, in the future we're going to have to look at whatever models for funding journalism can be found, and they will be rich in variety. They'll come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and philanthropy is bound to be one of them. Now, the Cairncross Review has recommended that journalistic organisations and groups should be able to apply for charitable status. That would be a big encouragement to trusts and foundations to donate, because many of them only give to charities. It would also boost the value of them, because we know that charities are got all sorts of tax exemptions and stuff like that. So that would boost at the low level, but as far as I can understand it, it could only apply to non-profit organisations. If you're an organisation like a national newspaper, which is in business to make money, you can't be a charity. That's, it's never one of the statutory aims of a charity that it's going to make money. That's just not allowed. So I don't think any of that's going to get money. But I think small organisations, and I've met people working in them, there are lots of them around the country, which do journalism to promote causes, to connect communities and so forth. Those might very well be entitled to charitable status, and that would be a very good thing.
That sounds fantastic, and I think that's great. At the same time, I understand that the Institute of Economic Affairs refers to itself as an educational charity. The very problems that having fake news out there causes with respect to elections could then afterwards come right back in the form of charitable status for US white nationalist billionaires, for example, let's say.
Yeah, I think that, there are debates to be had about who should have charitable status. I mean, clearly. But I don't think it's ever going to include profit-making organizations. So, for example, Eton College is a charity and gets all the benefits of being a charity. So, that seems weird to me. The place where all the richest people in the country send their kids to school and pay enormous fees is a charity? How is that? But I think having an argument about what constitutes a charity is different from having an argument, I mean, obviously it's an aspect of it, having an argument about whether forms of journalism might justify the name of charity. That's to say, can the charity commissioners, for example, monitor the output of a journalistic organization to ensure that it's not engaging directly in political activity or campaigning, which they can't fund, because they can't allow something to be called a charity if it's an actually active politically campaigning organization. Here I know the problems arise with organizations like the IEA, but there you are. That's the rule. And if we wanted, for example, the charity commissioners to look at the IEA and say, stop doing this campaigning, which I think a lot of people have asked, then we would also require the charity commissioners to go to journalistic organizations which campaigned for other things in a political way. So, these are tricky, but charitable status can, and I think will, help journalists and journalistic organizations, serious, public-minded journalistic organizations, to raise money where they can't get it any other way.
I think that's really, really good.